So our next speaker is Dr. Robert Howell. Dr. Howell is a professor of philosophy and chair of the philosophy department at Rice University. Dr. Howell works in philosophy of mind and published several books on consciousness and subjectivity. A book in 2023, Self-Knowledge and the Elusive Subject, and another book in 2013, Consciousness and the Limits of Objectivity. More recently, Dr. Howell is also working in philosophy of AI, and the topic of his talk today will be boredom and the prospects for creative AI. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Howell.
Thank you. Thanks to St. Thomas for having me, and I think it's great that you're having this event. I wish we had already had one at Rice, but you beat us to it. So congratulations. I think that you're exactly right. This is the time to start thinking about this. In fact, actually 10 years ago was probably the time to start thinking about this, but better late than never. So let me, before I kind of start with my talk proper, kind of give you a sense of how I fell into this and how I also wound up giving this particular talk. So it's actually kind of nice that I've sort of followed the discussion of virtue ethics, because that's sort of my own approach. Even though I'm not a Thomist, I find that to be a very plausible way to view ethics. And the way I kind of backed into the AI ethics space was I wrote a paper some years ago that basically asked the question, what would you do or what should you do if you had an app on your phone just like Google Maps that was Google Morals? And it basically gave you an answer about what morally you should do whenever you face some sort of moral conundrum. And needless to say, I didn't think it was the best idea to use that app, not only because of the fact that it probably would be wrong a lot, but because of the fact that I was really worried about what it would do to the virtues of the people who were actually using the app. And so this actually was intended to sort of be just a talk about, that was intended to be a discussion about sort of the way in which we defer to each other and machines in general, but it wound up generating a lot of interest for myself in just questions about the ways in which we interact with technology and the ways in which those interactions might augment or in many cases might deteriorate some of our virtues, some of our strengths. So I will be talking a little bit about that sort of thing in this talk. But I was actually thinking about giving a version of that talk, and as I started writing it, I became astonishingly bored, because I'd said this before, and I didn't feel like saying it again. And even though it might have been new to you, I was sort of restless with it. And then I started thinking about that restlessness, and I started thinking, actually, that's an interesting feature in which I differ from AI. AI doesn't get bored. It's going to continue giving the Google Morals talk again and again and again ad nauseum. And I started to think about ways in which that might actually be a good thing, in which some of the things that we actually don't cherish about our lives, for example, boredom and anger and frustration and things like that, might actually be really important and worth thinking about when we think about ways in which we do or do not want to incorporate AI into our lives. So sort of big picture kind of thought that I'm hoping that we discuss is that sometimes I think when we're thinking about designing AI, we try to think about it as sort of being the very best versions of our rational selves that actually don't err in the ways that we err, or don't tire in the ways that we tire, or that, don't actually wind up, doing stupid things when we haven't had lunch or something like that. But I guess one of the things that I sort of want to encourage us to think about, and that this talk is only going to be an example of, is that it could well be that some of these features that actually we don't always cherish about ourselves, that make us the most human, are precisely what should lead us to sort of steer away from that picture of AI. That is, cherishing some of the features of our humanness that actually we don't always appreciate may be a good reason for not handing over some of the tasks to AI that we're inclined to hand over to AI. One of the reasons to have a human in the loop may very well be that they're flawed. Okay. So that's kind of sort of an overview. So here's my question that I decided to talk about. Can AI be creative? And there's a real worry that this topic, too, can become boring rather quickly. So it looks interesting, but like here's how that conversation oftentimes goes. Somebody says, of course it can. Look at all that it does. It just spits out stuff that's crazy good. And then other people say, yeah, but is it really creative? Creativity requires X, and it requires Y, and it requires Z. And so the standards for creativity get ratcheted up, and then the response is like, well, yeah, but maybe humans aren't that creative if you ratchet up standards that much. So for example, oftentimes when you talk about the creativity of AI, you get people saying, well, it's creative in a way, but really it's just jumbling up a mishmash of its inputs and giving you some sort of a, algorithmic result as a result of that. Well, I think that, when I talk to my students about that, especially the ones who are in computer science, because they tend to actually view themselves as computers, is they say, well, we're the same way. We actually spit out a bunch of stuff that we actually got as well. And so the sort of dialectic becomes quite boring because of the fact that it turns out that, we can sort of say that computers aren't creative, but we might wind up saying we're not creative in the process. So I think that I'm going to proceed a little bit differently because I want to ask the question that I think is actually maybe surprisingly connected for me to the question about whether AI can be creative. And let's ask the question about whether AI can get bored. Now, I take it that at least in any current understanding of boredom and AI, the answer is no. I mean, it just doesn't seem like it actually gets bored. Now, whenever I talk about boredom, that's kind of the catch for the talk, is the relationship between boredom and AI, the boredom and creativity. But the sort of other side of boredom is taking an interest, is being sort of engaged and intrigued by something, finding something that's curious, right? And I take it that by the same coin, by the same token, that I don't want to say that AI can get bored, I don't think AI can do that either. So I'm going to want to kind of suggest a very simple argument with the conclusion that AI can't be creative, but the overall goal of the discussion is less to prove that than to think about ways in which we might ought to think of creativity in a way that actually ties it closer to our humanness, so that we don't kind of get into this rut that philosophers sometimes get into of coming up with necessary and sufficient conditions for creativity and then slowly kind of piecing together this or that, which is boring. What we should instead do, I think, is look at what we enjoy about creating and look at what we enjoy about creative people and creative products, work our way backwards from that, and then ask the question whether or not it makes sense to have AI be involved in that, or whether it makes sense to actually treat AI outputs as creative. So, a little confession, I was tempted by the slogan, if something can't get bored, its creativity doesn't interest me. Now, that's a little too loose even for me, but then I realized I was giving the talk here, and I didn't really have any good answer to the question about whether or not God could get bored. And so I thought I might leave that for more reflective minds than me to answer. So I am talking about, I think, a fairly human sort of creativity here. And I'm also sort of talking about the sort of creativity that we see in not only artists that we appreciate, but also in mathematicians that we admire, or what we think of in terms of the computer programmers even that we admire. All right, so before I get on with my thesis, I promise you I won't spend too much logic chopping here, but I do at least want to get sort of the standard view of creativity on the table. And it's standard not necessarily because everybody agrees with it, because that's not the way philosophy works, but because of the fact that it's kind of the launching point. We start disagreeing because we start disagreeing with this. And it's Margaret Boredom kind of said it very clearly. She basically says that at least for cases of psychological creativity, when she says that creativity can be defined as the ability to generate ideas or artifacts that are new, surprising, and valuable. And now, like everything else in philosophy, this can be debated ad nauseum. And in addition, it can be refined ad nauseum. So, for example, what are we wanting out of the new here? Well, new could be like new to the entire universe, so that nobody's ever seen it before, which would be an extremely high bar for creativity. But when I'm saying that my 14-year-old or 13-year-old is creative, I'm not saying that, right? I'm saying in some sense that it's new given the sort of field that he's been exposed to, right? And that's probably a more reasonable thing to approach. Surprising here, I think, isn't, of course, just to basically, make us jump out of our seats, like a jump scare in a movie. It's rather novel, something actually that is new, but it's also surprisingly new. So, for example, let's say that, I added up to 100 and everybody claps, and then I add something like 101. Like, it seems like you should be like, that's great, but not surprising as far as, what you were doing. That's probably not the most creative moment of my life. And then valuable is hotly debated, not only because of the fact that there's a real question about what sort of value we're talking about here. Is we talking about morally valuable? That seems like that's a pretty high bar for creativity. I think most musicians will fail that. Sorry. But I think that, if you talk about aesthetically valuable, that gets difficult. But one of the criticisms that's been kind of raised about this is it looks like even there can be creativity in some pretty awful ways, right? You can think about sort of the creative serial killer or something like that, where it looks like creativity may or may not be tied to value. Now, I think that there's interesting discussions one can have about that. But setting aside the niceties of this, and it's worth, debating if we want to, I think that actually it's the case that there's a pretty good case to make that AI can match this basic structure. So here's an example of AI art. It's called the Théâtre d'Opéra Spécial. I don't know exactly how to say it. But it was done by a guy from Colorado, so I'm not going to make too much of a big deal about pronouncing it correctly. It was generated by a prompt by Jason M. Allen, and this was actually the winner of a fine art competition at the Colorado State Fair. And when he did win the Colorado State Fair competition with this, it generated quite a good deal of hubbub. In fact, it wound up in the New York Times, and you can look it up and read about the whole story there. Of course, people were wondering, in what sense did he do this? In what sense should he get the prize? And things like that. But my point in showing it here is just to say that, I think that actually it's not that bad. I mean, it does seem like it's new in a relevant sense. It's novel in a relevant sense. It has at least some value, I think. And though the prompt came from Allen, the lion's share of this came from an image generator. Is it high art? Probably not. But we presumably want to allow high school students to be creative. And having seen a lot of high school students' art, this is pretty good. And you usually wind up seeing a good deal of elves on horses and things like that, which is in the same neighborhood. And so I think that we should want to include this as creative if we want to include our high school students as creative. Well, even if you're not impressed by the visual art, you might be impressed by the music. So if I could ask the
dust on the wind, boots on the ground, smoke in the sky,
really
no peace found.
But we can turn it off.
Rivers run red.
I mean, I hate it, but nevertheless, it sounds a lot like the Eagles. And I think that tells us something about the Eagles, but it also tells us something about the way in which they're trying to create music. They were trying to create music by finding what was successful, and they're going to generate a whole bunch of plot points of success, and then they're going to go right through the middle of those plot points to generate the music. And I actually, I do have friends that I admire, at least in some respects, who listen to this sort of thing. But I do think it should count according to the first three standards for creativity, right? How exactly it was composed, I actually don't know, so we would have to get into details on that. Oh, did I just turn it on by pressing? Okay. Okay, so one of the things I did is I wanted to, there's my elephant. So I might say something like this. The Velvet Sundown is not creative in any meaningful artistic sense because its outputs are generated by algorithms that recombine existing musical patterns, rather than originating from human intention, experience, or imaginative risk. Margaret Bowden's influential account of creativity distinguishes between genuinely novel ideas and mere recombinations with established stylistic spaces. AI music systems operate precisely by statistically remixing prior works within such spaces without conscious understanding or purpose. I will not continue reading that because you might have guessed that that's just coming from ChatGPT. I gave it the prompt, and that's it. Argue that the Velvet Sundown is not creative. It knew what Velvet Sundown was, and it immediately generated that. And I think I probably could have pulled it off if I didn't tell you that that was generated by ChatGPT. I think you'd probably think that that was me, maybe just being a little bit boring, which may not be that much of a deviation from my standard. So this seems creative in the sense in which a lot of our students are creative. Frankly, I have graduate students who I would love to rewrite it this nicely, actually. This is going to be on YouTube, isn't it? Anyway, so I think it's going to count as creative. A lot of philosophers have wanted to add another condition to creativity in order to try to get around this. I mean, this is just one problem they see, and that's to add an agency condition. And it does seem as though part of the problem here is that there's really kind of no creator in the right sort of sense. And so, something additional might be that a creative act has to come from an agent in a particular sort of way. Now, this opens up a massive can of worms because of the fact that philosophers have talked about for a very long time and will continue to talk about until the heat death of the universe what an agent is. And we might wonder what sort of agency is at stake here. Is it a moral agent? That seems to be asking actually quite a lot to me, because it seems to me that there are not only, by moral agent, I don't mean necessarily somebody who actually is being moral, but I mean somebody who is the appropriate target of praise, moral praise or blame. Somebody who we might be right to say, you deserve punishment because of this act. You deserve moral praise because of that act. And so is that the sort of thing we're looking for? And I guess I'm a little worried about that because it seems like there's plenty of creative people who may actually not be functioning all that well in a lot of other ways, or at least optimally in other ways, such that we actually wouldn't hold them to be moral agents. I actually think children, among other things, can be creative. And it looks like we don't want to say that they're moral agents in at least many cases. Nevertheless, I do think that there's something to that. I think there's something to all these, for what it's worth. What about autonomy? Well, I actually have read a number of papers that basically say, you have to have autonomy in order to be creative. Now, of course, that's another hot one, because what exactly autonomy amounts to is a little messy. You've got, notions that come from Kant. You've got notions that are having to do more with sort of being free from causal influence. A lot of stuff. But it is plausible that actually AI isn't going to pass that bar. But it's not totally clear to me that you need to pass that bar in order to be creative. Without going into the details of the Kantian view or the deterministic view or anything like that, it looks as though we're going to want to say that people are creative despite the fact that they aren't fully autonomous in this sense. Should they have to be conscious? I think that this is not uninteresting as well, but I think we'd want to articulate why. I'm a big consciousness buff. I write a lot about it, and I think it's extremely important. I think that, for example, one of the reasons why we shouldn't worry about shutting down our computers or harming our AI systems is that they're not conscious. So I think that value in the world comes with consciousness to a great degree, but I don't know exactly how to pin consciousness onto creativity in as clear a way as I'd like to. In some ways, you could view what I'm saying here as an attempt to start that. I do think that there's something about being deliberative that we want out of creativity, but I don't want to overemphasize that either, because it does seem like there are these blasts from the blue, right? There are these moments of eureka that look like we want to say that they're genuinely creative moments. And while there might be a sort of deliberative framework that has sort of laid the bed for those sorts of moments, it doesn't look like they're necessarily directly the result of deliberation themselves. So I think that we are heading actually down the right path here. But I'm going to propose to jump over these with a somewhat, admittedly half-baked, but an attempt to kind of provide a provocative thesis, namely that a creative agent must be the sort of thing that can get bored. Now, this is just a necessary condition, in that basically, when I want to say that something is a creative agent, I'm going to have a hard time saying that it's a creative agent if it can't get bored. Why is that? Well, first of all, I think I should say a little bit about what I have in mind by boredom here. Right? I don't have in mind the sort of like face in the mashed potatoes boredom that actually leads people to, contemplate suicide or something like that. That's not what I have in mind. I actually don't think that that's a terribly productive or creative moment. Nevertheless, I do think, however, that there's something about being bored with a particular sort of artifact or a particular way of doing something or a particular sort of process that a lot of creative people have. Right? That part of being creative is actually recognizing that the same old isn't worth doing anymore. Or at least it's worth experimenting with something new. And that experimenting with something new isn't just a matter of sort of relieving the feeling of boredom, but it's a recognition of the value judgment that is part of boredom. Right? So when I'm actually thinking about writing another talk on Google morals and talking about virtue and AI, I'm a little bored with it, in part because I'm just not sure that for me that's worth doing anymore, at least right now. Now, there's lots of different ways I can react to boredom. One is I can decline to come to the conference and go off and ride a speedboat or something like that. I don't know. That's not really what I do, but something fun, right? Or I can begin to kind of look around and kind of look at the edges of my boredom and try to get my fingers underneath the lid of the thing. Try to figure out exactly what it is that's making me bored with this. What was it that interested me about it a second ago that no longer interests me about it? And is there a way that actually I can sort of find that interest in something close by? And in my case, actually, like I say, I found it in the thinking about the boredom itself. I found myself saying, boredom's kind of interesting. But it's the sort of boredom, right, that actually doesn't just shut you down, that actually causes you to reflect and look for the interesting. And so, at least, sort of my basic suggestion is that there's at least a notion of agency that we can actually begin to triangulate using these sorts of notions. Namely, that what we're looking for in a creative agent is an agent that can find things boring, can find things interesting, and then can actually generate artifacts and generate ideas based upon trying to negotiate between these two subjective extremes. Now, I think that that's a start. I think that there's a lot more to say, and I think that it's going to involve figuring out, among other things, whether or not, what sort of boredom are we talking about, what sort of is involved in taking interest. But I have to admit that even though boredom is where I started with this thing, as I continue thinking about it, I really think that actually this lesson is a much more general one. And it goes back to kind of what I started out with. And that is the idea that what we're looking for oftentimes when we're looking for the good that is creativity might actually be rooted in experiences and things that we don't tend to like. Right? So among them is being bored, but others could exist too. So I think we should expand the scope of the sorts of things that we think are important to be combined with creativity, namely anger, grief, frustration, outrage. So this is Guernica by Picasso, and it's about, it's an anti-war piece, oftentimes considered to be one of the great anti-war pieces in history. And I take it that he was in part generating this out of a sense of grief, out of a sense of anger and frustration. And a ton of art is obviously this way. So what is this just, so here's the simple argument that I want to give as a result of that. Is just, only things that can be bored or find things interesting can be creative. Computers cannot get bored or find things interesting, therefore computers cannot be creative. Now I do add yet, because I don't want to make bets about the future, but I do think that before they are able to be creative in the sense that we're looking for here, namely the sense that's attached to things like boredom and finding things interesting and anger and frustration, they're just going to become to look an awful lot like us. Whether or not that's possible or not, I'm not going to speculate on, but we're nowhere near there. So why is this argument important? Well, I think that it's important because of the fact that when we are continuing to hand things over to artificial intelligence, we are actually doing it in some ways to streamline our activities. We're doing it to make the system more frictionless, to make it sort of more, perfect in a certain respect. But it's actually not the reason that we hired humans to begin with, because of the fact that they were frictionless or they're perfect. I think that recognizing that part of the virtue of hiring a human is the fact that he doesn't show up for work sometimes because he's bored and wants to spend time with his family, because of the fact that sometimes he's sick, because of the fact that sometimes he's bored and depressed. The fact that they're bored and depressed might actually tell us a little bit about the sort of environments we're putting them in and the sort of world we're building. So I'm trying to kind of make this argument, it's less of a philosophical argument about like the nature of creativity, but then asking us, when we're asking what we want these things to do, and we're asking if they're accomplishing it, let's not actually come up with a set of standards that actually divorces what they're doing from who we are and who we want to be in the sort of environments that we want to generate. So there's a possible objection to what I'm saying about creativity, but I actually don't think it's worth spending a ton of time on. Can there be boredom simulators? Can AI do a good enough job of simulating boredom and interest to get very close? I think that's probably so in a way. I mean, like whenever you're using Spotify or Tidal, which is what you really should be using, before you're using these things and giving pluses and minuses, right, and saying I like it, I don't like it, every time you're doing that, you're actually giving it some sense of what you're interested in, maybe. But and it could be that enough training and reinforcement like that will actually generate AI that can actually make interesting things. I don't know. I mean, it's going to depend a whole lot upon what exactly goes into that sort of training model, but at the end of the day, it's not going to be still, I think, the sort of creativity that we want, because it's not really going to be bored, and it's not really going to be interested in anything, and it's not really going to be angry. So one of the sort of paths that I like in this literature that I kind of want to direct you to somebody else instead of myself, Lindsay Brainerd at the University of Alabama, Birmingham has written a number of good pieces, in my opinion, on creativity. And one of the things that I think she does well is begins to divorce the question of human creativity. I've said divorce a lot in a Catholic school. Anyway, is to begin to divorce the question of creativity as like an analytic question to like, why do we value it, right? And why exactly am I going to value getting a creative result from a human versus a robot? And part of it has to do with human connection. And so I'm going to basically just riff off of her story here, but I want to give her the credit, repeat her name, Lindsay Brainerd. And I think that what she essentially says is, and I can put it in the terms of this talk, is that we tend to be bored by similar things. We tend to be interested in similar things. What other people find interesting tends to actually generate new interest in us, and part of it's because of the fact that we share similar backgrounds, we share similar cultures, but we don't completely share those similar backgrounds and cultures. We differ quite a bit too. One of the real benefits of having a diverse group of people, a diverse group of influences around you, is that, it gets a little boring if you have exactly the same sorts of backgrounds. I can listen to the Beatles an awful lot, but eventually I'm going to want to hear something, that's, maybe done on gamelan or something like that, that is something I've never encountered before. By doing that, that's a different thing, I think, than actually just hearing some random beep boops from a computer that might be something I've never heard before, but that doesn't actually come from a cultural place. It doesn't actually come from a place of contentment, frustration, worship, all the things that we do as humans that actually lead me to connect with the artists who are behind the music or behind the writing or behind the whatever. Right? And so part of the reason why I think that thinking about creativity in the way that I'm doing and that Brainerd is doing is that it highlights some of what we value about things as consumers of creative artifacts. Namely, we don't just value it because it's flashy and new and surprising. We value it in part because of the fact that flashiness and newness and surprisingness issues from a background of humanity, a background of pain sometimes and of happiness sometimes, and that these are important things. And I think that I want to pivot just a little bit to say that like this same story, I think, can begin to show us another risk of artificial intelligence I think that we should be careful about. So a couple of them. One, based upon what I just sort of said, is that there's a little bit of a worry I have, and I'm not sure, how justified this is, but I have to say that it seems to be pretty compelling, is that the more we actually interact with artificial intelligence and begin to actually sort of view its creativity and its productivity as sort of aspirational, the less we actually are drawing upon our own notions of creativity and our own notions of productivity, which may not actually be very productive in some cases, what actually might be seriously and deeply flawed. And because of that, we actually are beginning to prevent ourselves from developing these sorts of warts and edges that allow us to actually communicate and mess with others in such a way that it's a valuable experience and a valuable experience for a community to have. So part one is basically just the idea that we don't want to let ourselves be trained in a way by our environments, which I think our environments do shape us, and we don't allow us to be trained by our environment so that we basically become detached from each other, and we don't want to begin to actually sort of idealize the sorts of things that computers can do and that we can't do. The second thing, and I think that this is actually maybe even more important, at least it's closer to home for me, is that we should acknowledge that maybe sometimes being bored is a really good thing, right? Maybe we're bored for a reason, right? Maybe actually the fact that I don't feel like doing my work today is a sign about my work. Now, sometimes it's a sign about me. Sometimes I need to get over it, right? I don't actually give this talk and then allow my students to not show up to class for the rest of the semester. I think that, there is a happy medium here. But the idea, though, is that I actually have a tendency, I'm just going to self-report, to when I start getting bored, I pull out my phone almost immediately, right? And I start messing with, games or Polytopia or whatever, and then I start, looking at Instagram and looking at the funny things that people say and blah, 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 right? And that can be okay. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But it's a very old point that basically we're distracting ourselves. But the point as it connects into with this talk is that by distracting ourselves, we actually might be eliminating the actual very fertile ground upon which creativity grows. I mean, part of being a kid for me was being bored, right? And part of actually getting out of that was making stuff, was beginning to hack around on the piano, or beginning to make up stories to myself, or beginning to tell stories to other people. You look at artists, for example, like Newton, who was, if you look at his life story, it wasn't the best childhood. Wouldn't recommend raising people this way, but he was bored. If you look at Proust, he was bored in bed a lot of the time while he was writing because he was sick all the time. Boredom is actually something that we should not necessarily run away from. And I guess I think the same thing is true about anger and a lot of these other things. Obviously, it can get out of hand. You don't want to wind up with your face in the mashed potatoes. But at the same time, you don't want to actually put it away so quickly by pulling out your phone at every second. So thank you. Stay human, and happy to talk further about boredom.
So when you're laying out the idea of creativity, one thing that may be missing there is kind of skill. In the theater, the opera spatiale, I think people were normally angry because creativity-wise, he put the prompt in there, and he spent a lot of time coming up with the prompt for what he wanted it to look like. But what actually came out involved none of the skills that a normal visual artist would look for there. So in terms of that, and you can connect it to that boredom, and this kind of allows you to spend time developing skills, kind of. So I just wanted to see if you comment on that and its role in creativity and what we value as creativity.
I think that's a great point. And I think you're right that actually leaving skill out is probably a mistake. I think that it's one of those things that there are cases where it looks like there may be people who are relatively unskillful who nonetheless actually come up with amazing things. But I just want to kind of remind, so the way that I was sort of setting things up was trying to say that actually it looks as though the computer, not the dude who entered the prompt, but the computer looked skillful to me. And I don't know whether that's quite right to say that the computer was skillful, but I think that there's a certain interpretation where it seems like it is. And so if I did add skill to sort of the conditions of creativity, I'm inclined to believe that computers are going to pass that. But there's something in your question that I think is really helpful as well, which is, though, that I mean, and this is something that philosophers have talked about a lot recently, is the notion that by using computers and using AI, that we're actually de-skilling ourselves, right? And that we actually wind up, the more we hand over, the less actually we're doing things ourselves. So I do think you're right that that's why the outrage was there, because, why should you get the prize because you just entered in a prompt? There is something interesting about cases like Duchamp putting a urinal in an art gallery, and one might ask what sort of skill was involved in that, and you might actually say that this guy's doing something similar, in that basically he's doing something that's ingenious in a way it never will be again. You can't put another urinal in an art gallery, but at least not on display. And maybe the skill there is recognizing what's culturally important at the moment or something like that. But I think it's a good point. One question is basically, how do we articulate skill in such a way that actually computers don't wind up just being way more skillful than we are in so many respects?
I have a comment. Maybe it's a question. I'm not quite sure. But when I was growing up and I would say, "Mom, I'm bored," she would say, "Choose something else. Get your crayons, paint something, make something." And so repeatedly over time, I learned to channel boredom into cooking, painting, learning a language. And I see young people today, it's so disturbing that they are allergic to boredom, and they are not finding that as an opportunity to turn it into stimulating and growing themselves. So I do see that it is removing skills from people left and right, even autonomous cars. I am a skilled driver. I can do donuts on ice. I can, I can shift by ear without having to engage the engine. Every time I'm in these vehicles that have all the bells and whistles, I think they are removing people's skills. So how would you address that?
Well, yes. I basically, I totally agree. I do think that, I do think that we should be a little careful not to fetishize some of the things that we had to do, back in the old days that we don't have to do now, because it may be an opportunity to develop new skills and other things as well. But I think the general idea, though, of reflecting on the skills that we're deploying, the skills that we hand over, and trying to think about and think carefully about ways in which those might actually be sort of pulling the rugs out of our own feet, from under our own feet, that might be important. So, as a chair of a department, I don't actually love being chair of a department, surprisingly. And but one of the things you have to do is you have to write evaluations of your colleagues, which is not a lot of fun. And so I actually tried at one point, because this was recommended by a good friend of mine who's an economics professor. Just upload this to ChatGPT, say, write an evaluation, and then see what happens. And it was an okay evaluation. But not only did I feel really terrible about even handing that in, but I also feel like that pain in the butt that was involved in actually writing that process of articulating why I think that their work is valuable, why I think that this may not have been the best use of their time, thinking about ways to communicate it to my particular dean, right? And given what she values, and in light of the particular lives that I'm commenting upon, sort of reflecting on that made me realize that the pain in the butt was sort of worth it. That's actually part of building me, building my relationship with my dean, building my relationship with my colleagues. And so I think that there can be just a billion cases like the ones you're talking about where it may look as though, boy, wouldn't it be great to have automatic transmission? But I think we need to be really reflective about and maybe just look past obvious benefits to see where we might be handing over our chances for training ourselves in good ways.
Thank you. I had a question, or maybe it's a little bit more of a comment. I think this is a really beautiful articulation from boredom and anger and all these human qualities that allow for true creativity. My question is, looking really broadly at this over time, let's imagine 100, 200 years ago, we had the same technology just pop open in front of somebody. and they would have no question about what's human creativity and what's not, and we would very easily just say human creativity is the only kind of creativity that we accept as a society. Now, from what I've seen over the last 20 years or so, there seems to have been a slippage in this very ultra basic thought process. And you could say it comes kind of with the computers themselves and the internet and social media kind of deviating from the core creativity that humankind was always familiar with prior to that. But then to what degree have we now as a society been primed to ask this question without the simple boundaries of simply saying human creativity is creativity, core creativity, by initiatives like Citizens United, where you're giving agency to things that are not human agents anyway? And is that not maybe the main slipping point? And as we go down the next steps of giving agency to, which is already happening right now, is giving agency to GPTs, is that where we're really losing our humanity technically, step by step? And have we been on this slide for the last 20 to 40 years with this just being, now if you ask somebody, we ask these questions. 200 years ago, there would not have been a question about what creativity is. So that's it.
Great. So I see two parts to your question at least. One part of your question was what you started and ended with, which is the idea that like this type of question only flourishes in a particular world, given a particular background. And it's one where we're already seeing a lot of creative products, and we're actually beginning to acknowledge these things as creative. And I think that may very well be true, although, I mean, actually, it has been the case, I think, that for a long time people have asked questions about mechanical creativity and things like this. There's actually really interesting, cases in, like, even the 1800s of them sort of looking at, very, very what we would consider primitive robots to say, like, were they creative? But let me set that aside, though. Part of me actually is really glad for the context that we're in right now, in part because it helps us provide cases that force us to ask this question and come up with answers that are maybe a little bit more subtle than we had before. So while before we might have been willing to say, that's not human, therefore not creative, now we're seeing things that look an awful lot like human creativity. And I think that's actually, as a philosopher, I think a helpful spur to actually think about, okay, well, what was it that I really was latching on to when I said that it's human creativity? Was it the fact that it was particularly pretty, or was it the fact that actually it came out of a human experience that required skill? And so in some ways I'm actually sort of grateful for the context of artificial intelligence because of the fact that it helps us focus upon the questions of what do we value about humanity. But the second question is one that I think that a lot of us fear about, which is the idea that in some sense we are sort of expanding the context of a lot of our concepts, like agency, maybe moral worth, things like that, to actually include things that wind up maybe dissolving our own, or at least making it seem less central and important. And I think that is a real issue. I mean, I don't want to be sort of a doomsayer or ignoring the problem, but I know that as a teacher, my sense is that one concept that has become really quite blurry is the concept of plagiarism and originality, and what is my original work, and what is a legitimate creative act by me in an academic classroom versus not. And I think that this is related, that basically there's, it becomes the case that our concepts, which were really pretty solid perhaps before, now are getting a whole lot more porous. So I think that's a little bit more dire, but I also think it's another opportunity perhaps to get better at articulating what it is that we were wanting in the first place. So one of the things that I do, just to kind of pivot to the plagiarism case, one of the things I do is I feel like it's really important for me to take the opportunity to explain, like, why are you in this classroom? Right? What are we getting out of this classroom? And one of the things that I think that they're oftentimes surprised to find out is that I don't actually care what's in your paper at the end. Like it's not as though I need to read another paper on World War II and you're going to basically cause me to be like, oh, that's what's going on in World War II. Right? That's no history professor ever said that, really. what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to see you think about World War II. We're wanting to see you think about like what is good evidence, bad evidence, what sorts of things lead to conflict, what sorts of things cause us to lull ourselves into moral submission. That's the sort of processes that we want to do. And so I oftentimes tell my students, coming to here, to my classroom with ChatGPT is like going to the gym and bringing a robot that lifts the weights for you, right? Nobody would do that because you recognize that the point of the gym isn't to lift the weights, it's to actually build you, right? And so what I guess I'm saying is that even though sometimes these concepts and these situations are frustrating, I've actually found them to be pretty apt causes to reflect and try to articulate what I'm up to.
I know there's been a lot of, this will be the third commenty question, but I had a sort of suggestion, and forgive me if I've tried to shoehorn everything into a Thomistic understanding, but it seemed like everything you were saying kind of pivoted on how humans have desires, and I'm sort of shoehorning boredom into a desire. It's kind of restlessness makes you desire something more. And I wanted to suggest that maybe the connection to consciousness has to do with how you don't have any desire if you don't have any real consciousness of the object of desire.
Yeah.
If there's no apprehension, there's no desire.
No, I love that path. I think that that's something I want to think more about. One thing that my colleagues and I at Rice think a lot about together is sort of the value of consciousness. And among the things that we try to think about is to what degree, for example, consciousness is required for the apprehension of value. And to me, actually, I'm with you. It seems quite clear that it does. I do think that actually thinking of it in this way is a nice corrective to some of the ways that philosophers of mind have been thinking about consciousness, however, which is just like, what is it like to see red, or what is it like to be a bat, or to taste bacon, or something like this, right? I think that thinking about consciousness as basically a prerequisite for certain valuations and for certain things is really kind of important. It's also related to what you said is that one of the reasons why I kind of felt like using Google Morals was such a bad idea was actually an element of virtue that wasn't mentioned in the last talk, but like is certainly very present in Aristotle, which is the idea that you have to have the right feelings when you're actually performing the right actions and reasoning. So, for example, like if I'm giving to somebody on the side of the road and I'm still feeling like, oh God, giving out money to bums again, right? I'm not generous, right? I mean, no matter how much time I give to somebody, I'm not generous in part because of the fact that my sort of cognitive disposition isn't actually allied in the appropriate way with what I'm actually doing. And so I think that you're right to say that basically it could well be that consciousness plays a pretty big role, not only in our thinking about creativity, but in our thinking about some of the moral aspects of the situation.
Thank you very much for these presentations. I really like. So I've been mentoring young professionals for the last 3 years, and the anxiety that comes together now, you see in this panel, the different ages, is a common goal, what to do with AI. And during these 3 years, I found that, well, it's a tool. I'm not as articulate in the technicalities behind, but it's a tool. And one of the things that I keep bringing, especially for the young professionals, and now for everybody, that creativity is one of our values. And the message that I try to say here, rather than just a question, is that for the first time, maybe humanity will need to look forward, because it is impossible that it doesn't matter what technology you have, an AI cannot create jazz with information before the 1920s. So it was that human factor that makes the pain, the suffering, maybe the superposition of all those elements in our brains. Maybe sometime it will be one person, maybe it will be a culture or a community. What the idea there is that creativity is in here in us is probably the entropy, and let's focus that. Let's not look back again to, I need to learn how to milk a cow so I can get milk in my house. It's now, okay, what do I do now? And thank you very much. Just this comment.
No, I appreciate that, and I mean, I think there's a lot of different strands of what you said. But one thing that I think is quite right, and that I agree with, is that we shouldn't become Luddites. We shouldn't actually put our heads in the sand, and basically say, oh gosh, wasn't it better when we actually went to town on a wagon? I think that's the wrong move too. So I guess what I would encourage us to do is to think about our tools, and basically to think about the way in which our values are sort of embedded in our tools and the ways in which those tools actually shape our values. And what's peculiar about AI is just how strong it is, how big it is, how quickly it's growing. I mean, there was not really sort of a philosophy of shovels panel back in the day. And not just because there weren't universities around, but because of the fact that it was really kind of a more piecemeal sort of thing. And AI does look like it's kind of infiltrating our lives, and so I think that prompts a little panic in all of us. But I think you're quite right that we shouldn't turn that in. We shouldn't ignore the fact that it is ultimately a tool, and we have to make decisions accordingly.
One more question.
This is probably going to be a short question, but I wanted to ask. The simple argument of this talk was that boredom is a new thing you propose for creativity. But you also talked about other emotions other than just boredom going into creative pieces. What are the bounds of that? How broad do you personally think it would reasonably make sense for, as a prerequisite of creativity?
Well, I kind of want to. I think it's a good question, and it's not an easy question to answer. Sort of the general picture is let's actually take some of the things that actually we didn't actually view as being valuable and recognize how our ability to undergo those things might be part of what makes us creative in the ways that we value. And so from that perspective, I want to be very open-armed about the various things that can come into that, and don't want to basically say, oh, let's make a list of prerequisites such that basically we're going to say no, yes, is more. So I am aiming for something a little bit more holistic. That being said, as I'm thinking about this, and I must admit I'm fairly early on in thinking about this, as I'm thinking about this, I do feel like there are certain human emotions, human foibles that might be more constitutively connected to creativity than others. So I mentioned anger. I actually think that in a way anger isn't actually as constitutively connected to creativity than boredom and interest, in part because it seems like what we're looking for in creativity is a certain sort of newness and a certain sort of novelty that's more closely connected with our feelings of boredom and interest than it is connected with anger, and that some of these cases might be more sort of causal spurs to creativity rather than sort of constitutive parts of it. And so I guess that my way to begin to address that question in my further thinking about it would be to try to distinguish between the things that are sort of more constitutively connected to the values of creativity and the things that more are contingently, productive of it.